The Rainbow Magic Fairy series was originally written in England. Here are all the changes I noticed which were made to Rainbow Magic number 7, Heather the Violet Fairy, when it was released in the United States. In the opening poem, Thick Ice Form becomes Thick Ice Forms. Mortal World becomes Human World. Fateful is removed from this fateful day. All the rainbow fairies are together becomes Rachel and Kirsty have found all of the rainbow fairies. The fairies becomes But the Fairies. Chapter 1. The numbering changes. The US version starts on page 1, but the UK version starts on page 9. Holiday becomes Vacation. On Rainspell Island is added after Holiday. It rose in becomes It flew through. Beside becomes next to. Jack Frost's wicked spell had banished becomes Jack Frost had cast a wicked spell that banished. Fairyland had no color becomes Fairyland had lost all its color. A sentence starting with the Fairy King and Queen is added to the text. Kirsty and Rachel becomes the girls. Saffron becomes Sunny, here and everywhere else her name appears. Izzy becomes Inky, here and everywhere else her name appears. There was jest becomes they had only. The kite tug on its string becomes a tug on the kite string. Winding in becomes pulling in. Bobbing becomes floating. Helped Rachel to untie becomes helped Rachel untie. Smooth it out becomes smooth it out on the ground. Lifted up by the breeze becomes swept up by the breeze. Rolled becomes gathered. Mum becomes mom, here and everywhere else it appears. Garden becomes yard. The sentence starting with they ran through is split into two sentences at the word which becomes it. Whisked out of sight becomes flew out of sight. Where's it gone becomes where did it go? Pulling aside becomes pulling back. As she squeezed is removed. There's a sign saying becomes there was a sign that read Summer Fair today. Went through becomes walked through. Stalls were selling becomes there were stalls full of. Candy floss becomes cotton candy. There were people becomes people roamed. Looking round becomes looking around. Fluttering towards becomes fluttering toward. Round becomes around. Ran across the grass becomes ran across the grass together. Rachel stared with delight becomes Rachel stared. They were beautiful is added after the sentence ending with poles. Lovely becomes wonderful. All becomes all painted. Red becomes there's red. Rachel looked closer becomes Rachel looked more closely. Whirling horses becomes spinning horses. Just then is added to the start of the sentence starting with the merry-go-round. Help the riders dismount becomes help the riders off their horses. Chapter 2, have a go becomes take a ride. There are two becomes there are only two. Is called becomes is named. Is called becomes is named. Hold tight becomes hold on. Started up becomes started. The ride becomes the merry-go-round. And she becomes suddenly she. Tugging at becomes whirling through. Oh becomes wow. Brilliant becomes awesome. On the pillar in the middle of becomes in the painting on. Halt becomes stop. The tiniest tinkling laugh becomes a tiny laugh. It was coming becomes coming. Round becomes around. Horse becomes horse in the picture. Floaty purple dress becomes purple dress. Long purple stockings becomes high purple knee socks. I've just found becomes we found. Chapter 3. Was helping becomes was still helping. We've got to becomes we have to. But how and what becomes but what. Scrambled off the merry-go-round, all the other children, is removed. Clowns, comma, so Rachel and Kirsty, becomes clowns, period, Rachel and Kirsty. I've got becomes I have. There was something there becomes she felt something inside. Slim becomes skinny. Kirsty felt puzzled becomes Kirsty was confused. The word remember is added after the word shall. All round becomes all around. Silvery laugh becomes tiny laugh. The magic brush had painted Heather back to life becomes The magic brush was lifting Heather out of the painting. Hovering becomes floating. Delight becomes excitement. Around them becomes around the girls. Kirsty held her out of view becomes Kirsty hid her from view. The wood becomes the woods. Glade becomes clearing. Trailing branches becomes long branches. The other rainbow fairies were close behind Inky is added after found our missing sister. Saffron flew becomes Sunny even flew. Followed by the other rainbow fairies is removed. Flowers and leaves becomes flowers, comma, leaves. Frog footman becomes frog. Beaming from ear to ear becomes with a huge smile. Doing a cartwheel becomes doing a cartwheel in the air. I've been tingly with magic becomes I've been feeling extra magical. Fluttered down to land becomes fluttered down and landed. Now we're becomes now that we're. We must magic a rainbow becomes we must use our magic to make a rainbow. Rainbow to take becomes rainbow that will take. Spun round becomes spun around. Glade becomes clearing. Stared at becomes looked at. Each other becomes one another. They cried becomes they whispered. Fluttered closer to Saffron and Queenie becomes fluttered closer to Sunny and Queenie for protection. Harvesting becomes picking. Glade becomes clearing. Chapter 4. Jack Frost's angry voice becomes Jack Frost cackled, his angry voice. Icicle snapping becomes icicle snapping in half. Ruby declared becomes Ruby answered. Spattering becomes cracking. Window pane becomes window. I shall becomes I will. Before Jack Frost could point his evil finger becomes before Jack Frost could do anything. All our rainbow magic powers becomes all of our rainbow magic powers. Have come back becomes has come back. Held Rachel's hand becomes held Rachel's hand and watched. Rachel and Kirsty becomes Rachel and Kirsty both. A sob of dismay becomes cries of dismay. Each other becomes one another. At one side becomes off to one side. Looking as if becomes looking like. Forwards becomes forward. The wicked fairy becomes Jack Frost. Oh, well done becomes great job. Pot at the end of the rainbow becomes pot. Magic becomes make. Still might escape becomes could still escape. Skittered becomes scampered. They have their own homes to go back to becomes their homes are here on Rainspell Island. Giving Queenie and Fluffy little kisses and hugs becomes saying goodbye to Queenie and Fluffy. Towards becomes toward. Laughed and delight becomes laughed. From thee becomes from inside thee. Round becomes around. Stop you getting becomes stop you from getting. Sky's wings becomes sky's tiny wings. She pointed out is moved to the end of the previous sentence. Sledging becomes sledding. Without winter, how can spring follow? Becomes without winter, when will we have spring? All thee becomes all of them. Lovely becomes beautiful. All them becomes all of them. Lovely becomes beautiful. Then becomes that's when, and it's moved to the start of the sentence. We have to have becomes we need. Most importantly is removed. I feel sorry becomes I also feel sorry. And all becomes all. Very brave becomes very kind and brave. Whizzed over becomes flew over. Very nervous becomes nervous. Wind whipped becomes wind spun. Spinning round becomes whirling around. Now Jack becomes first Jack. She caught sight of becomes she noticed. Glass dome becomes glass globe. This change will happen a lot. Dome becomes globe. There was is removed. Leaping angrily about becomes leaped around angrily. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Jack Frost's becomes Jack Frost is. Chapter 5. Shouted becomes cried. She flew over becomes Rachel flew over. Dome becomes globe. Trembled becomes shook. Leaped about becomes jumped around inside. Snow dome becomes snow globe. She didn't like being so close to Jack Frost is added before into the pot. A bit becomes a little. A bit of squash becomes a little cramped. To mind becomes to care. Like a rainbow-colored firework becomes like rainbow-colored fireworks. Upwards becomes upward. Hillsides becomes hills. Rachel gasped in horror becomes Rachel gasped. Next to them becomes next to the girls. Outwards becomes outward. Gazed becomes watched. Every color becomes in every color. Now the river becomes the river. The clearest blue becomes a bright, clear blue. Shown softly pink becomes shown pink. Rachel and Kirsty and the Seven Fairies becomes Rachel and Kirsty. Towards becomes toward. Titania and Oberon become Queen Titania and King Oberon. Out of the palace becomes out of the palace after them. Diamond crown becomes diamond tiara. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Jack Frost scowled and didn't answer is removed. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Full bony height becomes full skinny height. Sledge becomes sleigh. Chapter 6. Watch out for magic becomes watch for magic. Say goodbye becomes say goodbye to the girls. Hug them all in turn becomes hugged each one of them. A bit sad becomes a little bit sad. Enormous shining rainbow becomes enormous rainbow. Sucked into becomes swept up by. Fizzing becomes glowing. Said Kirsty becomes cried Kirsty. The holiday cottages becomes Rainspell Island. They landed becomes the girls landed. With a soft bump is removed. Front garden becomes front yard. It's a shame that becomes it's sad. Looking out for magic becomes magic finding us. Said Rachel's mom becomes said Rachel's mom as the girls ran into the front yard. For one last time becomes for the last time. She stopped dead becomes she stopped. Rachel went closer becomes Rachel walked closer. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Shapes. All the colors becomes shapes in all the colors. Rachel breathed becomes Rachel said. Glass dome becomes glass globe. In her hands is moved to the end of the sentence. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Beamed becomes smiled. Snow dome becomes snow globe. Think of Fairyland becomes think of you and Fairyland. That's it. It's about 222 changes for a 71-page book, or about 3.12 changes per page.